Now, ideally, what you would do for something like this is, you know, it's a little bit of an inconvenience to have to pump water up maybe once or twice a week when we're using it at its full belt. I mean, I can go do something else, just start the generator and let it pump and time it. And so it doesn't really take a lot of time from my work schedule, but it's a little bit of an inconvenience. So ideally, I would build a barn above this level with enough roof space to filter water or run water into that tank. So you'd have to, there is a hill behind this that's tall enough that if I built a barn with roof space on it, tapped into a gutter system and then into a pipe and then into this tank up here, that would keep it filled, and as long as the overflow is working fine, it shouldn't be a problem. So, or of course the ideal would be to have a gravity fed spring above this level, which I don't. We're almost at the top level here. We just have a little bit of hill left, and there's no springs that I can find above this level. They're all below this level. So, so when you build your house on a piece of land, you know, that doesn't have a well, and you don't have the funds for well drilling here is very expensive. You have to go at least 300 feet through a lot of rock. The first thing to look at is okay, if I'm going to use a primitive water system, I need to find out where my spring is and build below it. I mean, that may be what you have to do. Not always ideal, because it's better to build on high ground than low ground, but sometimes you'll be blessed enough to have a spring that's in high ground that you can utilize. So this is our straw bale house. We've got 3 solar panels, and we've got a little antenna there to help bring in phone signal, because we're sort of in a little bit of a what would you call it, sort of an armpit of a hill here, not quite a valley, but a little cove where it's very sheltered. And so that antenna there, we bought that for about $50, and it brings in and amplifies the signal well enough that we can text and make some calls. So this is a straw bale house, very efficient. They're better suited to drier climates than Missouri and anywhere east, but they can work if you set them properly on a concrete footer and that straw stays dry. I put a porch all the way around. This porch was totally built out of existing logs, as you can see, and as was the porch all the way around. Saved a lot of money that way, and so we have porch sheltering the sand and clay mix that makes the mortar. Now it's not finished, that's an early layer. It would eventually look a lot smoother and nicer, so we never got to finish putting layers on. That will have to happen later, but nevertheless, it's working fine. We've had it this way for several years now. So we're inside the cabin now, the house, and you can see we got the straw bale walls there, and we've got internal walls made from local lumber that I milled on a little bandsaw mill that I bought. Even put in an upside down tree there. And we got a wood stove, a gas cooker, and we have our little solar powered refrigerator, which works great and takes very little power. Here's our sink. This sink was part of an old house ruin. I just pulled it out and installed it. And now the thing with gravity fed pressure is when you use regular plumbing, this is about all you're going to get. The regular piping increases pressure with regular pressurized water, but with gravity fed it reduces pressure really, and reduces flow, because there just isn't that much pressure behind the system. But what I found out was to attach a hose fitting gives you plenty of pressure. So that's the same, coming from the same source, but look at the difference with a hose. So that's just running a hose from the 1-inch. I brought in a 1-inch poly PEX down low, and that's tapping right off of the 1-inch to a 3/4 hose, and so it stores a lot more pressure. And but the 1/2-inch fittings really cut down the flow. See, that's the regular plumbing. So regular plumbing is made for high pressurized water, and so you lose out with gravity unless you got a really high tower. So anyway, something we learned. So we use this again as our sprayer and clean off, and I have a sink outside as well to do the same thing. So the fun you can have with a house like this is, since it's just a sort of a cabin in the woods, it doesn't have to be fancy, but we use some old barn wood here for a wall partition between our utility room and the breakfast room. And I just like these old artifacts, so we got these with an old wood stove, cook stove that we have outside. And these rocks here were on the property, and they have dates engraved from 1890. Actually, I think it was 1908 was when it was actually engraved. The boy that engraved it was born in 1890. We thought that was pretty neat, so they'll eventually be installed. We have an outlet there for a stove, but I moved the stove over to the central area of the kitchen here, and we can cook on that. And by the way, if you don't have an oven, we do have an oven with our gas stove, but if you don't have an oven, you can simply use a pot like this. I don't know what they use these for, but they will basically make their own oven. If you put tile or ceramic tile in the bottom, make sure you get use ones that are unglazed, because there can be contaminants in the glazes. I guess they do have some safe glazes, but a lot of them contain lead, so we just use the regular tiles that have no coating. And that will bake potatoes or squash or anything just sitting on that stove. It works as a great little oven when you're just using wood and a regular stove. We have a cook stove outside for summer canning, a small one. We would eventually get a nice big wood cook stove, but we haven't been able to afford that yet either. Here's a neat idea for a railing. I just simply went out and got fresh saplings that were supple and bendable. They were still alive, mostly oak, and we have millions of those, so I just cut them and wove a lattice work. And actually it's very strong because the upper wood is very solid. Just use drywall screws or deck screws to sort of put that together. But you can't really see them because I sunk them into the wood. And on the other side, we just used a simpler banister design made with small trees. Now these ones, I don't think they were fresh. They were probably older. Actually, they were fresh because the bark would fall off otherwise. If you cut certain types of trees fresh and dry them, the bark will stay on. Leaving bark on isn't always the best idea. We ran into some real problems with that, and I had to later on come along and take off the bark off the cedar because there were little bugs underneath. They blanketed the whole house in a very fine powder as they ate the layer of sap wood underneath the bark. And so, I didn't have a barn or anything to store my wood. I didn't have time to get all the bark off while I was building, although that's recommended, and I took a risk and I paid for it. And so I had to scrape it off later and vacuum up all that dust, and the dust was extremely fine. So in a lot of other cases I used a sawmill to square off the beams. In some cases I left some of the bark on because I like it. Like over here in this, made our upper loft floors out of logs, again, save money. We just didn't have the budget for a lot of lumber, milled lumber, which is expensive. Here's an idea. We just stacked cedar logs here. These put off a nice perfume for the house, and I just think it sort of looks neat. Our stairs, that was really fun. So this stairs was actually built when the house was a shell, when there were no real fillings in the walls. In fact, I don't think the walls were hardly even up. They were just posts. And all I did was ran some logs through the sawmill and sectioned them into step sizes, and took my chainsaw. I didn't even use really a tape measure hardly. I just sort of winged it, and there we had a stairs to get up to the upper level and work on the lofts, which weren't really built yet. So that stairs was built early on very quickly. and it's very sturdy, as you can tell, because it's made out of two large oak logs laid up on a diagonal. I just used a simple winch system to get those up there with a board and rolling pipes underneath it, because we had to do most of this by hand. So we have our simple gas hot water heater. Needs no electricity at all, best type to have. And our utility sink, so this is our utility room. And vent system. I built this little fun fill-in. There were two posts there, and I filled it in with clay and sand and used jars to let some light into this room. So for our shower system, again, I found out that to use a hose end for the cabin, basically use a hose end, it gave much more pressure than a regular shower head. I mean, you can see the amount of flow we have here. It's quite good. I mean, that will really saturate you quickly. And to save water, because we're using just the 300-gallon tank, we run it and wet ourselves and then turn it off and soap up. It works fine in the summer. It's a little chilly in the winter. And so there's your hot and cold coming in. But yeah, really nice, large volume of water. I actually prefer this to a regular shower because it's not high pressure, but it just coats your whole body in warm water because the volume is high even though the pressure is low. So we have everything we need really without a well. There's my sponge gourd loofah. You can grow these things and make yourself a sponge for scrubbing your skin with. They're really handy. This one got a little stain because it sat for a while. They're normally just a lighter color. You can get those at Baker Creek Heirloom Seed Company. Loofah gourd, they're called. An heirloom. And so we have our simple toilet system, fed on gravity fed. Had a little bit of issue with that. Again, the pressure wasn't enough to fill the tank on the regular system, so I had to use a 3/4 line in to increase the pressure a little, and then adapt down to that little 3/8 size or whatever they use, which cuts the pressure way down, unfortunately. So I couldn't find a fix for that other than running 3/4 pipe as long as I could, and then coming off of an inch pipe actually as well. So of course, one of the questions you get with straw bale is, well, isn't it going to rot? Isn't it going to create mold? Actually, you have to have moisture for mold to grow. And so it wouldn't work well in the tropics, but in any climate where there's dry periods and very short wet periods, like in the summer here, it'll do okay. Obviously, it has to be placed on top, not on top of concrete. The bales go on top of logs that sit on top of the concrete. And there's an airspace between the logs, two sets of logs, make a sort of a track that they sit on. We put some sort of insulation in there. We used wool in our case. And so everything's dry, and so that does not create mold. If you put a straw bale in a dry environment, you can go back 100 years later and it looks just the same. It hasn't changed, it hasn't broken down. It's the same with wall insulation. Fiberglass will mold if it's wet. Anything molds when it's wet. So the idea that straw naturally creates mold is sort of an old wives' tale. It needs moisture to do so, and then it'll naturally break down like anything else. So drywall, even though it's got, formaldehyde and stuff like that in it, will grow mold too. You can treat your bales with certain types of things that may inhibit the growth of mold. But we didn't even need to do that really. As long as they're dry, they have a big hat and a big boot, you call it, a big foundation and a big overhang. And then the clay is what you use, the clay mortar, which is basically a sand clay mix, which is very strong and solid, much more solid than you would think. It's sort of like concrete, brittle concrete. And again, we haven't finished. We'd eventually finish with a nice smooth white layer. We left this gritty to give it tooth or grip for the final layer. But it's pretty strong. The nice thing about it is you can wet it in an area and then take part of it off and put an outlet in or whatever you want to do. And that's a whole different thing. How do you do outlets in straw bale? You can look that up, but I'm not going to go into that right now. You can run your wiring just right under the clay actually, and you can run it in conduit if you want. And so what was I going to say? This is the thing to use, and not cement mortar. Don't use cement mortar on straw bale. It wicks water. Clay wicks water away. It absorbs any moisture that might be in the atmosphere and lets it out rather than storing it inside. Cement, on the other hand, wicks water up from below and is just not a good medium. Because of its thermal mass qualities, it tends to build condensation and a lot of problems with it. Clay works a little differently and tends to be more of a dry agent in most cases. So the straw bale doesn't work well unless you use the proper type of mortar, which is a natural clay sand mortar. The sand mixed with the clay makes it extremely resilient and also keeps it from cracking, and it makes it much harder than just pure clay. Well, I wouldn't say necessarily makes it harder, but makes it more resilient, let's put it that way, than just clay. Just clay is more brittle. With the sand in it, you've got a second element that makes it really strong. Another thing some people do is actually mix straw in their clay in certain areas. And we would do that in infill areas where we couldn't put the regular mortar, like holes. You can use a light clay straw mix, which is basically a clay mortar, sand mortar with straw chopped up really fine. So we did do that in light clay straw applications in certain places.